Hello, and a very warm our channel. Today, Josie and I are joined by author Tim Wyatt to discuss the world of elementals and nature spirits. How are you, Tim? Nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you as well, Paul and Josie.
Brilliant. Okay. So I thought to start with, we would begin with a couple of questions for you. So some have suggested that the fairy folk exist only in human imagination. Is it possible that they somehow manifest as a result of human emotions or thoughts? Do nature spirits exist outside of our concept of time? And who are the secret commonwealth?
Okay, well, they certainly do exist beyond people's imagination, although in the modern world, nature spirits or elementals will be regarded by most people as just a remnant of legend, myth, or folklore, and they will be really described as primitive superstition rather than anything else. But we are the only society in human history that hasn't, in some way, had communication, knowledge of, and indeed perhaps cooperation with these secret empires. Now, when we're talking about these things, I think it's important to say that we're talking about two very separate classes of entities. On the one hand, there are the nature spirits or elementals, and these are kingdoms invisible to most people who are not clairvoyant, existing on the mental and astral planes, not on the physical plane. And these are, there are numerous different categories of them. But there are broadly the gnomes of the earth, the salamanders of fire, the undines of water, and the sylphs of the air. These nature spirits belong to three kingdoms below the mineral kingdom, and they are the least evolved entities on the planet. They are often described as the builders. There is a very separate class of entities called the Devas or angels. Devas is a Sanskrit word which means shining ones, because that's how they tend to appear. The Devas are an entirely separate stream of evolution from the human kingdom. They constitute a superhuman kingdom. And Devas will range in size from one that controls an entire solar system to one that controls a planet, one that controls a country, one that controls a particular mountain or part of an ocean. So they range from the immeasurably large to the much smaller. And the Devas are said to be the architects. They are the ones who concoct the schemes, dream up the ideas, and the elementals are the builders or the workers who carry out their orders. Now, that's the way that I would understand it. There are people who lump both these entities into a single class of beings, and I don't. I think it's important to separate them off. There is cooperation between the Devas and the elementals, but it's not that they are in any way equal. They have completely different functions and they operate in different ways. But if you're dealing, for example, with the nature spirits, every culture throughout history until industrialization set in, country folk in particular, had very close contact with these beings because they felt that they had control over the weather, the success of their crops, whether their children would be healthy, and they dealt with very fundamental everyday matters. So they mattered, and people communed with them at that point. A combination of industrialization, which meant that more people went from the countryside into towns and cities, meant that the relationship fundamentally changed. And as cities grew, and as the railways took over, and as Britain and other countries became industrialized, people became more and more divorced from the natural world. Another factor which saw the nature spirits especially go into retreat was the influence of the Christian church, which really talked about a lot of these nature spirits as being demonic entities, and they were very much discouraged, to the extent that the Catholic Church murdered millions of women in North America and, well, certainly in Europe, and the Protestants later murdered many women for witchcraft in North America because they happened to live in a remote hut in the woods, had a black cat, and used to do things with herbs. And they were immediately looked upon as being somehow in league with the devil. So Christianity and industrialization are, in my opinion, the two principal causes why we have become so divorced from these. And we also now, Paul, live in a world where seeing is believing. We only rely on our physical senses to make sense of the world and to interpret the world. And yet these things cannot be readily seen through visual means. Some of the nature spirits can be seen in what's known as their etheric form. The etheric is part of the physical spectrum, but it involves states of matter which are much finer than solids, liquids, or gases. So it's possible that the nature spirits, although they exist on another level of reality called the astral, may, in some circumstances, be able to appear in the etheric, but they are generally said to be shapeshifters, and they adjust their appearance to coincide with the perception of the observer. And they're often pictured, or were often pictured in, for example, the early 19th century as wearing the clothes of, say, the Elizabethan period, 200 or 300 years earlier, which is quite curious. But wherever you come across nature spirits in any part of the world, they're always configured in terms of the culture and the psychology of that particular country. For example, in the Hindu tradition, there are millions and millions of these nature spirits. 330 million are listed, but that's probably more a symbolic number. And so if you see nature spirits portrayed in Indonesia or by Native Americans or in Africa or by the indigenous tribes of South America, they're all visualized in terms of their own culture. There isn't an independent view of what these things are like. And so they will tend to appear to people, perhaps more intuitively than pictorially, in terms that people understand.
Wow. So you said something a moment ago that I would just like my head nearly fell off because it provoked a memory in me. And I'm sorry if anyone's hearing this story for the second time, viewers of my channel, but I'll just mention that when I was a very small boy, I lived in a very old terraced house that was built on farmland. And I used to have experiences, personal experiences with uh, little people. And in particular, the women that I saw in the upstairs of my house, this was when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I interacted with them. They were dressed in what I would describe as Elizabethan or possibly even medieval kind of costume. So they would have like long dresses and cone-shaped hats with veils, which is, and obviously you just mentioned, of course. So I find that very interesting. Are they a particular race of elemental beings?
Well, these are ones that are described by one of the early researchers into this, a man called W.Y. Evans Wentz. And he did a lot of work on legends and mythology, both in this country and in other places, in Egypt and I think in Tibet as well. But he went around the country and he interviewed country folk, and he got various descriptions of these different fairies. I have a book here which actually describes local fairies which just live in one particular field, in one particular village or town. So often these things can be very, very localized and just apply to a particular area. And they're often given local nicknames like, Tom of the Bog or something like that, because it just refers to a particular type. But they seem to be absolutely ubiquitous, but take on different forms. And what is also interesting with them, I mean, the elementals are said to, not be able to really think for themselves. And they are often described as being a bit like naughty children because they like to play tricks on people.
Mhm.
And the stories that Evans Wentz and many others collected, Conan Doyle was very interested in this, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And he describes numerous different types of spirits depending on where they are. I mean, they investigated Cornwall, Brittany, Ireland, Scotland, and although there's a similarity between these things, there are distinct local differences. But the stories about them are often the same. They are often accused of abducting children or good-looking young couples and that sort of thing. Sometimes they're described as helping people. There are many stories, and this is where possibly the tale of Rip Van Winkle comes along. Um, some country man is walking along a road late at night, and he's accosted by a fairy woman who leads him into one of the fairy mounds. This is particularly true for Ireland. And he goes in there and spends a night and feasts and has a good time. He thinks he's there for one day, but when he emerges, 1, 2, or 300 years have passed. And this story crops up in different forms again and again and again. Sometimes it's only 1 year that's elapsed, but it's a much longer period than he imagines. And this is similar to, Pluto abducting people into the underworld. So it's kind of like a regular myth that runs through human history, this idea of abductions and being taken to another place.
Absolutely. Just for the record, the fairies or the little people that I encountered weren't particularly nice. So I'd just like to add that to the record. The women used to appear and they used to encircle me and push me about a bit. So it wasn't a very pleasant experience, especially as, I was only sort of 5 or 6 years old at the time. Just going back to something you said earlier, Tim, about Christianity interfering with our connection with the elementals. What is the connection between fairies and ley lines? Because when Christianity became a big thing in Britain, it would seem that they built a lot of their churches on ley lines or hotspots, if you like. So was that done on deliberately to sever our connection?
Well, it's certainly known that the early Christians in Britain and elsewhere built their churches on the sites which had previously been sacred. So if there had been a stone circle, for example, they might try and build on that particular site in order to bring people into the new religion because it provided some kind of connection to the old religion. But there are numerous stories of people building on ley lines or on fairy mounds or fairy paths, and they start to build the church, and then the next morning they get there and find the stones have been moved 10 yards away because the fairy folk didn't like it. There are numerous stories of people building on fairy mounds, and really bad things happen to their families. Their children die, or they lose their fortune, or their crops fail, or something like that. And this is where the fairies can said to be very, very hostile towards human beings because they vibrate on a much, much finer level than we do. They will find a lot of human emotions quite coarse and quite disturbing to them. And that's another reason, probably, why the connection between fairy folk, between nature spirits, elementals, and human beings has been severed to the degree that it has been. Certainly in the West, in industrialized countries. I mean, there may still be places, I'm sure there are, which have a much more intimate connection with nature and where these things are able to take place in a more realistic way than we can do it now.
Yeah, that would indicate to me, I've seen these stories before in Ireland and countries like Iceland as well, which has a very rich tradition of fairy folklore. That we've definitely lost our connection because we'll dismantle some rocks or whatever sacred place it is, basically, because we're completely clueless that these elementals, that's their home. Whereas probably before, say, more than 500 years ago or whatever, we would know automatically that that particular place is a home for the fairies. So that's very interesting. Should I? I'll just bring in Josie at this point. Josie, are you still with us? Do you have any questions for Tim?
Loads of questions. The only thing is that you're sort of whenever you sort of start talking there, Tim, is you sort of raise such amazing issues that I'm drifting off and sort of thinking about ETs and all kinds of fabulous things. So we drafted some questions, so I'll try and keep as close to the questions as possible. One of the things that it's kind of like a bit of it's a hybrid kind of a subject is mermaids, because mermaids really they're not they're not within the realms of the fae. They're actually real. I mean, from what I gather is there's actual colonies of them. What are your thoughts about mermaids, Tim?
Well, they certainly feature in a number of traditions, not least the Irish tradition of the Tuatha De Danann, or the She. They have mermaid characters. I've seen pictures taken in the Victorian era, and whether these pictures are genuine or not, I don't know. But fishermen in different parts of the world hauling up mermaids, but certainly a creature or creatures which are part animal or fish and part human, again, have featured throughout human folklore and mythology. You've only got to see the scatters of the Greeks, or the centaurs, or Pegasus, the winged horse. So this idea of combining animals and humans together, you notice it in the iconography of Egyptians and everything. You see a human form with the head of the ibis bird on the top of it. So this is quite common. I don't have any particular great knowledge of mermaids, other than the fact it's another situation which is ubiquitous, because you find tales of mermaids running through so many different cultures, through so many different portions of history. There has to be some kind of commonality between them, So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, there's discussions about sort of mermaids over here in Ireland, that sort of and selkies, and where they can sort of change, interact, and sort of they can come onto land, and they can take off their skin, and then they can reincorporate into the sea again. But again, similar to the many of the stories with the Fae, is the continuity of the story, sort of both here and further afield, makes you sort of think that there's more in it than just sort of uh, some sort of a fairy tale. So the another thing is the to do with the she. I mean, if you're interacting with the she, was it somebody had said that the price of interacting with the she is too high. It's like what you were saying about Rip Van Winkle. It's like the battle. It's like the Ballad of Tam Lin, or what happened with the Reverend Robert Kirk, is sort of interacting with the she for them. It took too high a price. I mean, was it Robert Kirk was snatched away into the underworld? As the same with Janet, sort of in the Ballad of Tam Lin.
Yes, I've read Robert Kirk's accounts of these things, and his own personal experiences, and they are absolutely fascinating. When I was having a look at the She and the Tuatha De Danann, and I'm not sure of the relationship between these two groups. Some people talk about them as being the same thing. Others talk about the She being somehow descendants of the Tuatha De Danann. But one of the things that I came across, and I think this again is from Evans Wentz, is that the She were responsible for the devastating Irish famine of 1846 and 1847, which obviously killed a lot of people and forced a lot of people to migrate to England, to America, and other places as well. So that may have been evidence that they, are not always the most benevolent entities, and that they may somehow resent what human beings have done to the land. And when you look at what has happened over the last 250 years since the Industrial Revolution started, human beings have developed this mentality. And people used to say this even up to a few years ago: oh, we must conquer nature, as if nature was somehow the enemy and that we needed to subdue it in some way. So it's this idea that we are the masters and that nature is subservient, which is probably another thing which has forced this barrier and this division between ourselves and these hidden kingdoms.
It's an interesting concept, but Tim, in that particular instance, I haven't heard that story before with regards to the she, but I think I think what we're sort of seeing across a number of different fronts at the moment is politics and sort of very heavy kind of you know news that is getting out to the media. For the Ireland to reject the she would be it's a I suppose it may be sort of something that politically would have been advantageous to maybe whoever was trying to dominate Ireland, sort of the people that had come into Ireland um, as opposed to the actual connection with the land, sort of because as a result of, firstly, there was no famine. There was no famine in Ireland at that time. What had happened was, at that time, there was huge amounts of produce that were grown, but the Irish were taxed so heavily. Like, say, if you grew corn, or if you grew any kind of a vegetable, if you had to 80 or 90% of it was taxed and was taken off you. The only vegetable that people could actually live on, in terms of where they were actually able to keep anything, was the potato. So whereas at that particular time of the so-called famine, we'd shipped all of those vegetables. They all went to the UK and basically as trade, and it was I suppose it was a controlled um catastrophe. It was a completely controlled catastrophe, sort of on the Irish people. So I mean, it's an interesting sort of thing. I think sort of just would have our Irish listeners would be fairly adamant with regards to that particular sort of point, So but with regards to the she, I mean, even that's the thing, is people sort of look at the she as sort of whether they are the likes of our sort of basically our gods, sort of our, the likes of sort of our Bridgets and our Morgan and so forth, but also, are they the divas of Ireland, or the shining people? Sort of that's the kind of the dialogue and the rhetoric that people are sort of looking at. Basically, that they're so careful with regards to not offending them. Like, sort of, there's the work of an archaeologist called, was it Marion Dowd, and she makes it very clear that sort of that that they are very easily offended. Things like, was it urine or metal, and are sort of are components that they take an abhorrence with regards to, sort of a great offence to.
Well, I would say that the she, from what I've come across, they are more a part of what you would call the David kingdom rather than the nature spirits, although it may encompass both of these different classes of entities. But what I would also say is that when you come across these entities in different cultures, in Ireland and in other places, even in terms of the various types of Greek gods. At first, they had the Titans, who were then overthrown by the next generation of gods, the Olympian gods. They all represented different archetypes. And I'm sure this is the case in lots of different countries. And I'm sure it's the case with the she. I mean, when the Christians first looked at Irish mythology, they tried to downgrade the she from being demigods, if you like, to almost like fallen angels. And so they ascribed them the identities of kings and queens and heroes of the remote past rather than being demigods. So that was a clear attempt to reduce their influence. But many of the stories do seem to show that they do have a very malevolent side to them. And yes, they do seem to be easily offended by human behavior. I mean, this particular group, more than others I've come across, do seem to have this strong reaction to certain aspects of human behavior.
In the conversation, I think it's become quite clear that we've, over the last few hundred years, for various reasons, we've lost, or we've pretty much lost our connection with these worlds. So I suppose the obvious question would be, how do we make that reconnection? How do we, you know, regain that connection with the elementals, the devas, and the nature spirits?
Well, there are a number of people down recent decades who've talked a lot about this, talked a lot about reconnecting with particularly the devas. And one person who talked about this was a man called Charles Leadbeater, who was the one of the second generation members of the Theosophical Society. And he talked a lot about in the new age, the Aquarian age, whenever that starts, whether it started already or whether it's due to start later is hotly debated. He said there would be a much greater connection and indeed cooperation with them. And he also suggested almost that they might be vital in ensuring humanity's survival. Because one thing we haven't spoken about so far, what is the function of the nature spirits and the devas? Well, the important thing is without them, we and none of the other kingdoms of nature would exist, because they help to create us, they help to preserve us, and they help to renew us in a variety of different ways. They play a very, very close role, a pivotal role in the reproduction of human beings and animals and plants. Various different nature spirits and elementals preside over the development of a fetus in a woman's womb over the 9-month gestation period. And a number of authors like Geoffrey Hodgson, who was a theosophist and a very, very accomplished clairvoyant, he actually clairvoyantly observed a woman during 9 months of pregnancy, and he wrote this book about it, where he describes in great detail how the nature spirits and the devas preside over the creation of not just the physical body of the infant, but also its astral body and its mental body as well. So they play a vital role in all forms of creating, protecting, preserving, and renewing life in all the kingdoms of nature. So then they don't just happen to be there because then they're interesting beings. They play a pivotal role in evolution and in sustaining life on this planet and presumably elsewhere as well.
That's absolutely fascinating. So therefore, is there any connection between the nature spirits and the megaliths that to this day, for example, the pyramids in Egypt or the megaliths of Britain and Ireland, what is the connection between the nature spirits and megaliths in your opinion?
Well, there will be certain classes of nature spirits that are drawn to these places because effectively they are energy centers. And most of these sacred sites lie on ley lines or some other invisible grids, and they are potent points of energy. They provide a very sharp focus for energies. Some of the sacred sites are built not just obviously on one line, but where particular lines might intersect. So these are particularly powerful points. Ley lines are something which are comparatively new. They were a term invented by Watkins in the 1920s when he saw all these things in alignment: churches, mounds of hills, other geographical features. And he coined that particular term. But there are many other energy networks running through the earth. And many ley lines seem to correspond with underground water deposits or streams of some kind. So inevitably, where there are those kind of energies, certain types of entities will be attracted there because their job will be to work with these energies in ways that I don't particularly understand. But nature spirits and devas are essentially energetic creatures. They don't have physical bodies. They are there in much subtler forms, in the astral and mental forms. So their work will be no doubt associated with these, and there will be specific ones assigned to specific sites. Certainly, as far as the devas are concerned, we know that each house has its own deva, sometimes called a spirit of the hearth. Each town and city has one. Each country will have one. Devas will preside over places of healing like hospitals or clinics. They'll preside over buildings of administration, council and government offices. They'll also preside over things like law courts. It's also said that they may influence people in terms of introducing new ideas to humanity by overshadowing certain individuals, particularly those involved in artistic pursuits, artists, writers, musicians, but also legislators, people who want to achieve some kind of social reform, and others. And they are said to involve this, what Carl Jung would have called the synchronicity of learning, so that people are introduced to certain ideas. Jung called them library angels, and he often described it, be looking for some information, be walking through a library, bang into a shelf, a book would fall off, and it would just be the book that he was looking for. And he obviously ascribed that to synchronicity. But clearly they have many roles that we don't particularly understand. One of the most vital roles, particularly in urban situations where Devas would operate, is that they transform a vital energy known as prana, which by the Chinese is called qi, and which we would call vital energy, not particularly recognized by science yet, but it will be. And this is energy which is emitted from the sun, and the Devas play a part in stepping down that energy and distributing it to the various kingdoms of nature. It's a bit like the idea of a transformer station for electricity. You can't run your home on a 500,000 volt power cable because it would just blow everything apart. So it has to be progressively stepped down to the 240 volts or whatever we use in a particular country. So they play a vital role in that, as well as conductors of energy. And I think they also, as I say, they preside particularly over places of healing and will work with individual healers. So although we haven't got a particularly conscious connection with these worlds, we do unconsciously commune with them, whether we like it or not. Whether that cooperation and that communication can become more coherent and direct, I think depends upon us. And it's very difficult to cooperate with something when large swathes of the population, 98% of the population or whatever it happens to be, don't actually believe that these entities exist in the first place. They just believe that they're figments of someone's imagination, and they're just fictional characters dredged out of mythology and folklore.
Okay, so do you think that it's possible for the fairy folk to actually possess a human being, to take over their mind?
Well, I guess it is, because one of the things that happens, and particularly in magical ceremonies, is that ceremonial and ritual magicians will create a thought form, and a thought form is an elemental, and they'll be creating this artificial thought form on the astral plane to go and do things they want it to do. And one of those things may be to affect another human being. This, of course, is complete black magic and is not to be encouraged whatsoever. But yes, I think it's quite possible. And there may well be cases where people who are possessed are, I know it's a rather medieval idea of being possessed by demons, but I'm sure that this is possible. And I'm sure that, as well as possessing people, I think they can also influence people towards being obsessed with certain things as well, and to indulging in certain kinds of behaviors. So yes, I think that's broadly possible, but I do believe it's possible to protect yourself against these things, with fairly simple techniques, which I think people should learn. And certainly people like Dion Fortune, the 20th century occultist, one of her most famous books, which I think is still sold today and is very useful as far as this is concerned, is called Psychic Self-Defense. I read it myself some years ago, and it's very interesting and based upon her particular experiences when she was working for an organization. And there was one woman who was constantly on her back trying to dominate her and everything. And no doubt other entities would be involved in that particular process. Precisely how it works, I think, is very complicated and too complicated to go into here. But nevertheless, obsession, possession, strongly influencing someone to do something, especially something against their will, I think happens. Yeah, I'm sure it happens.
Fascinating. And
Wow.
go on.
Do you know, I'd love to know what techniques do you would sort of are you talking about there, Tim, with regards to ways of protecting yourself, or ways to sort of if there is sort of if there is a she or something, or some sort of a creature sort of stepping on your toes, what would you go about with regards to ways of protecting yourself in those situations?
Well, in my own case, I'm not particularly worried about any entities attacking me, but there are certain human beings who, over the years, have tried to attack me in various ways psychically. And what I do is use something called the mirror technique, which is where you just imagine that your whole body is a mirror, and that anything that comes towards you from these people literally just bounces back and gets reflected back to its source. And this is what often happens with people. This is why many magicians come to a very sticky end, because the malevolent or unclean energies which they have created have come back, have rebounded on them, and have affected them in the ways that they were directed against other people. But that's the way that I would do it. Although there are numerous techniques involving, ceremonies and herbs and burning incense and all kinds of other things, chanting. So I think that the important thing is to create a mental barrier, to be aware, to be psychically aware that you are under attack. And this is not always easy for people, because if they are being attacked, they probably ascribe it to other causes and don't understand this. But when someone, for example, gives you the eye, you can tell from someone if they've got malevolent or nasty thoughts towards you and everything, if you're in their physical presence. But what do you do about the people who are doing this from a distance? Because it can be achieved just as successfully from a distance. And I think what you have to do is you have to become attuned to these possibilities. And if you feel something within yourself, and if you feel that you're being attacked, you need to go inside yourself and ask what the reasons for that are. Because the answers don't lie out there. The answers lie within you, as indeed most wisdom does. It's all very well, consulting books and doing all that kind of study, as useful as that is. But the real energy and power and knowledge lies within each one of us. So this protection, this being able to protect yourself, involves another human faculty, which in most people is latent, and we would call this the wisdom intuition principle, which is higher than the mental principle. And this is whereby you can get direct knowledge and information which somehow not bypasses but transcends the intellectual faculty that we have. And you get this inner certainty about things. Now, this will become ultimately, over time, over many generations, as much a human sense as taste, touch, hearing, smell, etc., etc. It will become something very powerful. At the moment, only a relatively small proportion of people have this. And in its most basic form, it would present itself as a hunch, or a gut instinct, or a feeling that you have to do something, or something is not right. And that in its crudest form would be the first indications that someone is starting to develop this. Another way you can tell whether it's developed in people is that it's all about conscience. If someone has a conscience, then you can bet your life that they also are starting to develop this higher wisdom intuition principle. And this particular principle is absolutely, I think, at the core of being able to protect yourself, because it gives you a much greater knowledge, not only of yourself, but the influences on yourself from other sources. But there are, as I say, there are many, many different techniques, and people will have techniques which are comfortable for them. Some people may do it in terms of ritual or ceremony. other people will do it on a more personal basis, as I've just described.
Thank you very much, Tim. Um, Yeah, so I'm sort of going through C.S. Lewis at the moment. I'm very interested in the whole Theosophical Society, and he seems to have been very tapped into a lot of the different things that we're talking about today. Actually, sort of the books like sort of The Hidden Strength. He actually refers back to sort of the likes of the fairy and the she, and it's almost like the genus loci sort of he has sort of stepping in to intercede in sort of dire situations, using sort of subtle communications, whether it's via dreams, to help the people, the characters out in his books. Do you think that do the fairy sort of step in to support a worthy cause, or is that sort of merely fiction?
I'm sure there are cases where they do that, but I think it's the higher class of entities, the Devas, who are much more pivotal in protecting people. Many people believe in the idea of a personal guardian angel, and it's something I find quite persuasive given some of the events in my own life where I've been in quite exceptional circumstances where I've come under great peril and things have happened to save me. One of the most interesting case histories about this is in the case of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. Throughout her life, she was ill many, many times and came very close to death, and various things intervened to protect her. But also as a child, she had numerous accidents. She fell from a tall cupboard when she was very young. She was unsaddled by a horse and was dragged along, or would have been dragged along had it not been some sort of intervention. She survived at least 2 shipwrecks, one of which where all the ammunition on board the ship blew up, and she was one of a handful of survivors off the Greek coast. And in another situation, she was shot when she was fighting for the forces of Garibaldi in Italy in the early 1850s. And I think in 1853, there was the Battle of Mentana, where she was shot at least 3 or 4 times and again managed to survive. So that would suggest that certain individuals, indeed perhaps all individuals, do have a guiding force or a protecting force of some kind. If you go into your average bookshop and you look in the mind, body and spirit section, you see that in recent years there's been a huge upsurge of interest in, particularly in angels, because obviously we still have a Christian tradition here in the West, even though it's much weaker than it used to be. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of books about using angels for healing and angels for this and angels for that. So we haven't entirely lost our connection with this. Obviously, people see angels still very much in terms of Christian iconography. They're often portrayed as having wings, for example. But as a number of writers have pointed out, this is not so much to do with any means of propulsion through the air. These are streams of energy, because essentially angels are energetic beings. They're non-physical beings. And these streams of energy might be the vestiges of them that human beings are occasionally able to perceive.
Is there a safe way of connecting with the likes of the fairy? I mean, sort of maybe with meditation, or maybe sort of enchanting of the land, and sort of to be giving back and to be celebrating the fairy, and sort of to open ourselves up with, and that includes the likes of divas, the shining ones, and sort of the elementals.
Well, I think the best way to try and contact these things is again through an intuitive rather than a visual process. If you go into the woods expecting to see fairies dancing around a mound, you'll probably be disappointed. But certainly, if you don't need to be a clairvoyant either. Sometimes when you go into the country, these entities will manifest in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes if you're walking through a wood, something will just brush against your face. or you will hear a sound, maybe running water or the wind, or the smell of a flower. And so the ways that they might show their presence is much more subtle. It's not suddenly going to erupt into some Walt Disney type movie, in all likelihood, not unless you've been, eating magic mushrooms or something. It's going to be much more subtle than that. When I have a small garden here where I live in Yorkshire, and try and keep it nice and as well stocked with many, many different types of flowers and trees. And sometimes there on a sunny afternoon, when you're sitting there, you can definitely feel a presence. You can't see anything very much. You don't see, inch-high elves crawling amongst the buttercups or anything like that, but you do definitely sense a presence, particularly on warm afternoons when the air is quite still. And there is a very, very definite feeling. And I think people are unconsciously drawn to certain locations like woods, the tops of mountains, and other places, because unconsciously, this is where they're most likely to encounter these presences, rather than in the middle of Oxford Street in London or something like that. And this is why, interestingly, people are drawn to beaches, because if you think about it, the beaches represent all the four different elements. So you'll get nature spirits and other entities representing these four elements. You get the sea, the land, the air, and the warmth of the sun, all connecting there. So when people say they go to the beach just to have a suntan or read some book or, drink beer or whatever they're going to do and go swimming, yes, they do it for those reasons, but there are much more important subconscious reasons why they're drawn to these places, because it is a confluence of energies. At least that's my theory anyway.
Yeah, Tim, that's very interesting. Just on that topic, sometimes I would go to places that were maybe known to be connected with the fairy or the she, and then I would get a feeling, sort of maybe something tickling the back of my neck, or sort of feelings like that, sort of, or even I would maybe see sort of like a glimpse of sort of the gentry or so forth. But how do I know it's what's the difference between spirit and the she and the fairy? I mean, I mean, is it spirit, as in being sort of like a ghost that's tickling the back of my neck, or is it the fairy? So
Well, I don't know is the answer to that, but clearly they are, although they're non-physical creatures, and they can be seen perhaps in their etheric form by certain people. What actually it is that causes the touch on your face or on your neck, I don't know. They may be able to do this mentally so that you feel that you have this, but I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Okay, I would just like to ask a question as well there. You mentioned magic mushrooms a few moments ago. I just wondered if you thought whether or not psychedelics could be a gateway, if you like, to connecting with the fairies.
Well, personally, I don't think that. I know there are very strong opinions on both sides about this, and I know people from both camps. I don't think these things are to be recommended particularly, because there are certain inherent dangers in these things, and you're dealing. I mean, when you take powerful things like ayahuasca, which is the South American thing, which I believe involves two different substances combining together, and that I think produces something similar to dimethyltryptamine. You do have to be very, very careful about these things. And you have to remember that the ayahuasca stuff was all designed for a certain people in a certain location with a certain culture. And, doing that in the middle of the Amazonian rainforest and doing it in a basement in Bayswater are probably going to be very, very different things. So I think people have to be extremely careful about these things, because there are other ways of doing it. People are obviously attracted to using psychedelics because it's quick and it's easy. And certainly back in the 1970s, very large numbers of people, not just hippies, but many other people were experimenting with LSD and many of the other psychedelics that were around at that time. I don't know whether people are interested in them to the same extent now. You do hear people talk about the psilocybin mushroom, which grows indigenously in Britain, and that having certain effects. But I don't think there's any shortcut to any of these things. I think you have to kind of put the effort in, and just to take a substance and hope that it's going to suddenly give you connections to other things or is suddenly going to make you enlightened, I think is rather naive and short-sighted. However, there will be people who disagree with me and think that it's something that is desirable, and it's purely a matter of what people themselves feel. But I would certainly be rather against these kind of things because of the dangers involved in them, particularly the dangers of people with perhaps mental health issues, because I have come across cases of people who have been very detrimentally affected by these things. I don't mean recently, but back in the 70s and 80s when they were much more popular. So I think that would be my conclusion on that.
I think I would agree with you. I think it very much depends on the mindset of the person involved as well. But going back to ayahuasca, I mean, ayahuasca is a huge experience for somebody to undertake. And as you say, it's been done for thousands of years in the Amazonian jungle with shamans, and a couple of blokes doing it in their flat in Southend-on-Sea. It's quite a different situation. So I would completely concur with that.
And
The
also, I don't think ayahuasca could be seen as a recreational drug, because from what I've seen, I watched a documentary about it, and it seems to involve large amounts of vomiting, and also the fact that you're going to be off your head for a couple of days afterwards. So it's not exactly the most recreational thing, because, to go through all that, I think shows a certain amount of dedication. But it's about the context of it, isn't it? I mean, doing it as part of your culture is different from just importing it from somewhere else and doing it in, as you say, Southend-on-Sea or whatever.
Absolutely. Okay. We're approaching the hour mark now. I'm just going to pause for a moment. Josie, do you have any more questions?
Um, we've kind of gone through the questions. What I'm kind of interested is with regards to sort of developing skills with regards to sort of the she. I'm actually at the point where I'm sort of about to join the Theosophical Society, that and maybe sort of the the Society for Inner Light, just because I think it's all part of everybody's development. Do you think that there is there development sort of within the Theosophical Society for the likes of these kind of topics?
Well, I think so. I mean, interestingly, a lot of the early theosophical authors, like Geoffrey Hodgson, whom I mentioned, and he wrote 6 or 7 books on this, Angels and Men, and books about the fairies, and even got an artist to illustrate these things as he described them. There was another man called Edward Gardner, who was also very interested in these things. And, well, they both actually investigated the famous case of the Cottingley fairies here in Yorkshire. I don't know whether you're particularly familiar with this case, but they made a film about it, and Conan Doyle actually investigated this. I actually grew up in the village of Cottingley, by the way, which is about 2 miles down the road from where I now live. And it involved these 2 girls who got hold of a camera during the First World War, and they took pictures of what they claimed to be fairies. And Conan Doyle and others went up to investigate. They made a film with Bill Nighy in the title role some years ago. And these films were examined by Kodak and experts, and they were pronounced to be absolutely authentic and everything. And then it all went quiet until the 1980s, when these girls had become old ladies. And they admitted that of the 5 pictures they took in 2 different sessions, 4 of them were fakes. And what they'd done is they'd just taken a girl's comic and cut out the fairy pictures and propped them up against the branches of trees. But they said that the 5th photograph was genuine, and it looks very different. If you look at the pictures on Wikipedia or wherever, you can see that one looks different. But the interesting point is that when Geoffrey Hodgson and Edward Gardner went up to Cottingley, they actually were able to see the same kinds of entities that the girls were seeing. And what the girls said was, eventually, when they admitted that they'd faked most of it, was that they were only showing pictures of the things that they actually saw. So, well, make of that what you may. Were they just trying to hoax people? I don't think so. I think they were genuinely in touch with some kind of entity. And I think that Hodgson and Gardner were also able to access these worlds. And in the early days, to answer your question, in the early days of Theosophy, there was a lot of interest in these things. But in more recent years, it's not one of the topics that is discussed very much within Theosophical circles. I started talking about this and researching it about 3 years ago now. And whenever I do a talk on this, there's more interest, there's more correspondence from people than on any other single topic, and it surprised me. I've done this talk in different forms to different groups of people, probably 15 or 20 times now. And it always evokes a great deal of interest. You get somebody afterwards who email you and said, oh, my grandmother who used to live in northern Finland used to commune with these things all the time. Or my uncle, who was an Irish farmer, he used to talk about the she or the various other entities. So it does have a very deep connection with people. And I think one of the reasons at the moment that people have become interested in this topic again is because we live in a world which is increasingly ruled by machines and digital technologies, which people find hostile and alien increasingly. And people want to go back to a much more natural world. People have almost like an inner hunger for this sort of thing, often without realizing it, but they just want a world which is not ruled by the harsh logic of materialism all the time. They want to believe that there are numinous realms. They want to believe that there are other dimensions which are beyond the physical and which they can explore and find out about. So this is probably the reason why people have become interested again in nature spirits and also in the Devas as well.
Yeah, just with regards to that, Tim, that's fascinating. The what was it? One of the things that came up, we had a conversation a few days ago with Miles Johnson from the Basis Project, and one of the things that came up was the fact that a lot of the tripping she sort of sites that would be sort of well known in Ireland, the likes of sort of Sligo, Benbulben, and in West Cork, that they're sort of also associated with the tripping she, and they're also associated with the portals and UFO activity. So I think that's it sort of begs the question, are the she are the she UFOs? Are they connected with sort of ETs or something along those lines? And people I think people are sort of slightly disaffected at the moment, and they're kind of maybe looking to some sort of like supernatural kind of help, sort of, and sort of whether the she can sort of help sort of with the with current situations.
Well, the Shi are often described as sky people or star people, which presumes that they came from other worlds. And there are so many cultures around the world. I was just looking at this the other day who talk about star people or sky people. Most of the indigenous tribes of North America, this was completely enshrined in their view of the world, as it was in numerous other locations, disconnected by time and geography. So a lot of people have talked about otherworldly beings coming here to assist humanity in some ways. Theosophy talks about in the distant past when human beings were developing and their mental faculties were not as strong as they might have been, outside assistance in terms of a group of people called the Lords of the Flame from Venus came to help beef up humans' intellectual abilities. And every culture talks about ETs of some kind. Now, I think one of the interesting things, which, and I do follow these things quite closely, programs about extraterrestrials and ancient aliens and the work of Eric von Däniken and other people like that. I think that some of these entities, some of the things which are seen, are not so much physical as interdimensional entities. So they may be entities which exist on finer planes of reality, such as the astral or the mental, and they may be able to step down into the physical spectrum. I don't think there's one size fits all here. I don't think there's one size fits all explanations for these things. And I think we're talking about many different things. But is there cosmic intervention in the affairs of the world? Of course there is. And there always has been. And, the most stupid phrase that I ever hear people saying, particularly on the mainstream media, oh, are we alone? Oh, what a ludicrous thing for people to say. But that's, I've spent my life as a journalist and I know how stupid and crass journalists can be. So that's why they say these things, because they don't, they can't get their heads around any other possible explanation for it. But yes, this world has been influenced by those from other parts of the cosmos throughout its whole history. There are so many traditions, for example, ranging from the Dogons of West Africa to many others, who talk about this connection between the Earth and certain other planetary bodies. And the one that comes up again and again and again is Sirius, which of course is a dual or even a triple star. Now the Dogon, 2,000 years ago, they knew it was a double star. How did they know that? They didn't have telescopes. They didn't have any technology to peer that far into the heavens, but they knew that it was a binary system as long ago as that. So I'm sure that this Earth has connections with other parts of the solar system, and the one that comes up again and again is Sirius, and the other one that comes up again is the Pleiades as well, and others as well. But those are the two most commonly associated with the Earth, as if we have some kind of long-standing connection with these worlds.
It's an amazing answer. Thank you very much, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I've learned so much today. It's incredible, and I'm looking forward to watching this one back, definitely. Tim, where can our viewers find more about you, your books, etc., more information?
Well, my videos are all over the place. You can buy my books and other things that I sell if you go to firewheelbooks.co.uk. That's where most of my books and other stuff is available. So if you can let your viewers know about that, if you can put up a caption or something, I don't know, but that would be very helpful if you could.
Yep, I'll link that underneath the video.
Yeah. Oh yeah, just but by other stuff, Tim is talking about his music. He's very, very skilled. I was just talking to Paul earlier. I was listening to his music, and Tim has an incredible singing voice. He sounds just like was it Roger? Oh, here from Pink Floyd. What is his name again?
Roger Waters.
Roger Waters, exactly. So
Oh,
I
I've
was
never
just
been compared to him before, but that's great.
you sound just like him. Actually, I was just saying that I was really, really impressed. So I'm kind of really picky about sort of what I listen to, but I really enjoyed listening to your music online. It's also available on YouTube. So yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. An absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
Is there some Bob Dylan influence going on there, Tim? I thought I might have spotted a little bit.
Just a little bit, possibly.
It's very, very good. It's on Spotify as well, so please check it out. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today, Tim. It's been a learning experience. Hopefully we can have you on again in the near future, because there's still many more questions that I've got. I know Josie's got more questions. So thank you so much for joining us today. and hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me. Thank
It's a
you.
pleasure. Please like, share and subscribe everyone, and we'll be back with another video in the very near future. Thanks everyone.